Imagine ruling the largest empire on Earth, yet feeling completely alone. In 1897, millions of people flooded the streets of London celebrating a woman who had ruled for 6 decades. Flags waved, bands played, and crowds shouted, "God save the Queen!" But behind the royal carriage sat a fragile 78-year-old widow dressed entirely in black. To the world, she was Queen Victoria, the powerful Empress of India and ruler of an empire that stretched across continents. But behind that image was a far more complicated story. A story of grief, rebellion, forbidden friendships, and a woman who refused to live by the rules of her own era. For decades, people believed Queen Victoria was a quiet, grieving widow who never recovered from the death of her beloved husband. But the truth is far more fascinating. Because after losing the man she loved most, Victoria didn't disappear. She transformed. And the final 40 years of her life became the most dramatic chapter of all. By the late 19th century, Queen Victoria had become one of the most recognizable figures in the world. Her empire stretched across continents, from Canada to Australia, from Africa to India. She wasn't just Queen of Great Britain. She was the symbol of an age. Yet despite all this power, Victoria rarely appeared in public. For years after her husband's death, she withdrew almost completely from London. Many people assumed the Queen had simply given up. Newspapers mocked her absence. Politicians complained she was neglecting her duties. Some even began to question whether Britain needed a monarch at all. But what the public couldn't see was that Victoria's private world was far more complicated than they imagined. Because the story of the Widow of Windsor was only half the truth. The turning point came in 1861. That year became what Victoria herself called her annus horribilis, a horrible year. Within months, she lost 2 of the most important people in her life. First, her mother died. Then came the devastating blow. Her husband, Prince Albert, suddenly fell ill and died at only 42 years old. Albert had been far more than Victoria's husband. He was her closest advisor, political partner, and emotional support. In her journals, she wrote heartbreakingly about the loss. She described Albert as her friend, protector, and guide. For years, she had relied on him for almost everything, even the smallest decisions. What dress should she wear? What political decisions should she make? Albert had been there for it all. Now he was gone. Victoria was only 42 years old. Yet she believed the most important part of her life had ended. In the depths of grief, Victoria began to transform Albert's memory into something almost mythical. She preserved his rooms exactly as they had been when he died. Every morning, fresh hot water was placed in his wash basin. His clothes were laid out. Servants continued their routines as if the prince consort might return at any moment. To Victoria, Albert had become more than a husband. He became a symbol. A perfect man whose wisdom she constantly praised. But this intense devotion created an unexpected problem. Her children, who had grown up with a strict and demanding father, eventually began to resent the idealized version of Albert their mother constantly spoke about. For them, the man they remembered was not a saint. Yet for Victoria, he had become almost sacred. For years, historians portrayed Victoria and Albert as the perfect royal couple. But reality was far more complex. Albert had a powerful influence over Victoria's life. In many ways, he controlled both her political decisions and her personal routine. Victoria adored him deeply, but their marriage also placed enormous constraints on her freedom. And something unexpected began to happen after his death. While Victoria's grief was very real, Albert's absence also removed the strongest authority figure in her life. For the first time since childhood, she was truly independent. At first, she didn't realize it, but slowly, everything began to change. One of the first places Victoria turned to after Albert's death was Germany. Many people forget that Victoria was actually 3/4 German. German culture had always been central to her identity. Her mother came from a German royal family, and Albert himself had been born in the small duchy of Saxe-Coburg. When Victoria returned to Coburg after his death, the landscape felt filled with memories of him. The forests, the hills, the quiet countryside, everything reminded her of the man she had lost. In her journals, she wrote something deeply revealing. If she had not been Queen of Britain, she believed Germany would have been her true home. For the grieving monarch, Coburg became a place of reflection, somewhere she could escape the pressures of British politics and reconnect with her past. But while the public believed their queen was hiding away in sorrow, something else was beginning to happen. Slowly, quietly, Victoria was stepping back into the world. And in doing so, she would soon discover new friendships, new influence, and a completely different version of herself. A version the Victorian world was not prepared for. While many people in Britain believed their queen had withdrawn from the world, the truth was very different. Behind the walls of castles and private residences, Victoria remained deeply involved in politics. In fact, after Albert's death, she began making decisions on her own, sometimes in ways that surprised even experienced diplomats. During the 1860s, Europe was going through a period of massive political tension. Germany, as we know it today, did not yet exist as a unified country. Instead, the region was divided into dozens of kingdoms and duchies. Two powerful states were competing for control of the German world: Austria and Prussia. The question that dominated European politics was simple. Would Germany become a peaceful federation of states, or a powerful militarized empire dominated by Prussia? And unexpectedly, Queen Victoria found herself right in the middle of this struggle. In 1863, Victoria traveled to Germany and attended an important gathering of European leaders. It was one of the first major public actions she had taken since Albert's death. And she was nervous. For years, Albert had handled these kinds of political negotiations. Now she had to do it alone. In her diary, she admitted how uncertain she felt. Without Albert, she felt like a ship without its navigator. But despite her doubts, Victoria did something remarkable. She attempted to act as a mediator between the rival powers. Her goal was simple: prevent war and encourage cooperation between the German states. She met with powerful leaders, including the Emperor of Austria, discussing the future of Europe. To British politicians watching from London, it looked as if the Queen was hiding away in mourning. But in reality, she was quietly engaging in international diplomacy. Many historians today believe Victoria's involvement during this period has been seriously underestimated. Behind her black mourning clothes was a ruler still very much engaged with the world. Victoria's personal life was also deeply entangled with European politics, because her children had married into royal families across the continent. In fact, Victoria would later be known as the grandmother of Europe. Her eldest daughter, known as Vicky, married the Crown Prince of Prussia. Meanwhile, her eldest son, the future King Edward VII, married Princess Alexandra of Denmark. When conflict erupted between Prussia and Denmark, Victoria faced an uncomfortable reality. Members of her own family were now on opposite sides of a political conflict. As both a queen and a mother, she felt torn. In private letters, she expressed frustration and sadness that politics had divided the people she loved. It was another reminder that Victoria's life was never simply personal or political. For her, the two were always intertwined. Despite the political tensions surrounding her, Victoria increasingly found peace far away from London. In the Scottish Highlands, she had first visited Scotland years earlier with Prince Albert, and the rugged beauty of the region had captured her heart. The wild mountains, the quiet forests, the open air. Compared to the rigid formality of Buckingham Palace, Scotland felt refreshing and free. But more importantly, it was here that Victoria met a man who would change her life in ways few could have imagined. His name was John Brown. John Brown was not a nobleman. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't even part of the royal household's upper ranks. He was a Highland servant from Balmoral Castle. Tall, strong, bearded, and completely uninterested in royal etiquette. In almost every way, he was the opposite of the refined and disciplined Prince Albert. Yet somehow, he became one of the most important people in Victoria's life. After Albert's death, Brown was assigned to assist the grieving queen during her stays in Scotland. At first, his role seemed simple: helping her ride horses, guiding her through the Highland countryside, and ensuring her safety during walks. But something unexpected happened. Brown spoke to Victoria in a way almost no one else dared. He was blunt, honest, sometimes even rude. Where ministers and courtiers treated the queen with careful politeness, Brown spoke to her like a real person. And strangely, Victoria loved it. Brown quickly became Victoria's constant companion. He accompanied her on walks, rides, and travels. He understood her moods better than most members of the royal court. While ministers discussed politics and etiquette, Brown simply focused on taking care of the Queen. For Victoria, who often felt isolated despite being surrounded by servants and officials, this companionship meant everything. She once wrote that having someone loyal and devoted near her was an enormous comfort. Brown's loyalty was absolute. He rarely took holidays. He was always available whenever the Queen needed him. In many ways, his entire life revolved around serving Victoria. But not everyone was happy about it. Within the royal household, John Brown quickly became a controversial figure. His behavior shocked many members of the court. He ignored traditional rules of etiquette. He spoke directly to the Queen. Sometimes he even contradicted her. To aristocrats raised on strict social hierarchy, this behavior was almost unthinkable. But Victoria tolerated it, and even encouraged it. And soon rumors began circulating. Whispers spread across Britain and even abroad. People began asking the same shocking question. Was Queen Victoria in love with her servant? Some rumors went even further. They suggested the two had secretly married. Others claimed they had a secret child. None of these stories were ever proven. But one thing was certain. John Brown had become far more than just a servant. He had become the closest companion of the most powerful woman in the world. And the relationship would soon shake the British monarchy in ways no one expected. As the years passed, John Brown became far more than just a servant. He was constantly at the Queen's side. He accompanied her on long walks through the Scottish Highlands, rode with her on horseback, and often acted as her personal protector. Brown's devotion to Victoria was obvious to everyone around them. But what shocked the royal household was how openly Victoria relied on him. She trusted him more than many of her ministers, more than some members of her own family. And she wasn't shy about showing it. In fact, she often praised Brown in her letters and diaries, describing him as loyal, intelligent, and deeply devoted to her well-being. But the more she praised him, the more uncomfortable the royal court became. Because Brown was not part of the aristocracy. He was a servant. And in the rigid social structure of Victorian Britain, that difference mattered enormously. Before long, gossip began spreading beyond the palace walls. Newspapers whispered about the unusual closeness between the Queen and her Highland servant. Satirical pamphlets appeared, mocking the relationship. One particularly scandalous publication joked about the Queen's fascination with Brown's powerful Highland physique. While some people laughed at the rumors, others were deeply alarmed. To them, the idea that the Queen of Britain might have a romantic relationship with a servant was unthinkable. Yet Victoria seemed almost indifferent to the gossip. If anything, she appeared determined to continue their friendship exactly as she wished. And in doing so, she did something that shocked even more people. In 1868, Victoria published a book. It was called Leaves from the Journal of Our Life in the Highlands. No British monarch had ever published a personal book before. The public expected something formal and royal. Instead, they found something surprisingly intimate. The book described Victoria's life in Scotland, her walks in the mountains, local Highland traditions, outdoor adventures, and quiet moments away from court politics. Readers discovered a completely different side of the Queen, a woman who loved nature, who enjoyed simple pleasures, who laughed and relaxed in the Scottish countryside. The book became an instant bestseller. More than 100,000 copies were sold, an enormous number for that time. But one figure appeared throughout the pages again and again: John Brown. Victoria described him as loyal, brave, and devoted. To many readers, it seemed almost as if he were the hero of the story. Her children, however, were far less impressed. They felt their mother was giving far too much attention to a servant. And within the royal family, irritation was growing. While the royal court whispered about John Brown, Victoria was also fighting battles in politics. One of her greatest rivals was Prime Minister William Gladstone. Gladstone was a brilliant politician, but he had a personality that Victoria strongly disliked. She found him overly serious, arrogant, and exhausting. Gladstone, on the other hand, believed the Queen should play a more visible role in public life. He often pressured her to attend ceremonies and public events. Victoria hated being pushed into public appearances. At one point, Gladstone asked her to officially open a new bridge in London. To him, it was a simple public duty. To Victoria, it felt like harassment. Letters flew back and forth between them, sometimes multiple times in a single day. The Queen stubbornly refused, then reluctantly agreed, then complained again. Their relationship became one of the most difficult partnerships between a British monarch and a prime minister. But if Gladstone frustrated Victoria, another politician had the exact opposite effect. His name was Benjamin Disraeli. Where Gladstone was serious and moralistic, Disraeli was witty, charming, and theatrical. He understood something very important about Queen Victoria. She didn't want lectures. She wanted respect. And perhaps a little flattery. Disraeli treated the Queen not like a political obstacle, but like a partner in governing the country. In his letters, he wrote to her with warmth, humor, and admiration. Victoria loved it. She once described him as romantic, poetic, and deeply loyal. Unlike many politicians who spoke down to her, Disraeli made her feel powerful. And their partnership soon produced one of the most famous political moments of her reign. In 1877, Disraeli proposed something dramatic. He suggested giving Victoria a new title, not just Queen of Britain, but Empress of India. At the time, India was the most valuable territory in the British Empire. The title would symbolize Britain's enormous global power. Victoria was delighted. When she signed official documents, she began using the initials Victoria, Queen, and Empress. The new title strengthened her image as the ruler of a vast empire stretching across the world. For Disraeli, it was brilliant politics. For Victoria, it was something more. It restored the sense of importance and purpose she had struggled to find after Albert's death. But once again, tragedy would soon strike her life, because the people she grew closest to had a habit of disappearing, and the next loss would break her heart once more. For years, John Brown had been Queen Victoria's closest companion. He had helped her through grief, loneliness, and the heavy responsibilities of ruling an empire. But in 1883, tragedy struck again. John Brown died suddenly. Victoria was devastated. Once again, someone she deeply trusted had disappeared from her life. In private writings, she described the loss not just as the death of a servant, but the loss of a true friend. Someone who had been completely devoted to her comfort and well-being. For the second time since Albert's death, Victoria felt truly alone. But surprisingly, history was about to repeat itself. Because only a few years later, another unexpected figure would enter her life, and once again the royal court would be thrown into chaos. In 1887, Britain celebrated Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, 50 years on the throne. To mark the occasion, representatives from across the British Empire were invited to Britain. Among them were two young Indian attendants sent from the city of Agra. One of them was a 24-year-old man named Abdul Karim. At first, Karim's role seemed very simple. He was meant to serve food and assist during ceremonial events. But within weeks, something unusual happened. Queen Victoria became fascinated by him. Karim was tall, confident, and educated. Unlike most servants at court, he spoke openly and intelligently with the Queen. Soon, Victoria began asking him questions about India, its people, its culture, its language. Before long, she promoted him to a much higher position. Karim became her personal Indian teacher. She even gave him a special title, the Munshi, which meant teacher or secretary. Victoria began spending long hours learning from Karim. He taught her words and phrases from the Hindustani language. She practiced writing them in her notebooks. Sometimes she even showed off her new language skills to visitors. But the Queen's interest in Karim went far beyond simple language lessons. She trusted him. She confided in him. And she often defended him against criticism. Just like with John Brown, Victoria didn't care what the royal court thought. And the royal court was furious. Many members of the royal household deeply resented Abdul Karim. To them, he was an outsider. an Indian Muslim suddenly elevated above British aristocrats. Some courtiers accused him of being arrogant. Others believed he was manipulating the Queen. Racism also played a major role. At the time, many British elites could not accept that the most powerful woman in the empire trusted an Indian servant more than them. The hostility became intense. Servants refused to treat Karim with respect. Officials tried to limit his influence. But Victoria refused to give in. She insisted he be treated like a gentleman. And anyone who insulted him faced the Queen's anger. Once again, Victoria showed that she was willing to ignore social rules if she believed someone deserved her trust. By the late 1890s, Queen Victoria had ruled Britain for more than 60 years. She had seen enormous changes. The Industrial Revolution had transformed society. The British Empire had grown to its greatest size. And Victoria herself had become a global symbol of power. In 1897, Britain celebrated her Diamond Jubilee. 60 years on the throne. It was one of the largest celebrations the country had ever seen. Across London, crowds filled the streets for miles. People from every corner of the empire came to honor their queen. Victoria, now 78 years old, rode through the cheering crowds in a royal procession. The sound of celebration was overwhelming. In her diary, she wrote that the cheering was almost deafening. Everywhere she looked, people were smiling and celebrating. For a woman who had once withdrawn from public life in grief, the moment was extraordinary. She had become a living symbol of an entire era. Queen Victoria died on January 22, 1901. She had ruled for 63 years, longer than any British monarch before her. But even in death, she left behind a surprising story. Before she died, Victoria gave very specific instructions about what should be placed inside her coffin. She asked to be buried wearing Prince Albert's dressing gown, a tribute to the husband she had loved all her life. But there were other items as well. Photographs of family members, personal keepsakes, and one small object that shocked many historians. A photograph of John Brown, along with a ring that had belonged to Brown's mother. The objects were hidden in her hand before the coffin was sealed. It was a final, silent acknowledgement of the man who had comforted her during the darkest years of her life. Queen Victoria is often remembered as the symbol of strict morality and rigid social rules. The entire Victorian era was named after her. Yet the real woman behind the crown was far more complicated. She loved deeply. She formed friendships across class and cultural boundaries. And she often ignored the expectations placed upon her. From Prince Albert, to John Brown, to Abdul Karim. Her life was filled with relationships that shocked the society around her. But those relationships also reveal something important. Behind the crown and the empire was not just a monarch, a passionate, stubborn, emotional human being. A woman who ruled one of the greatest empires in history, yet still spent her life searching for loyalty, friendship, and love. And perhaps that is why, more than a century after her death, the story of Queen Victoria continues to fascinate the world.